We live in a world of massive consumption. The opportunities for stimulating and pleasure-inducing activities are seemingly endless. Yet it often feels as though all of this pleasure leads us further and further away from a life of lasting joy and happiness. In today's book, author Anna Lembke explores the exciting new scientific discoveries that explain why the relentless pursuit of pleasure leads to pain and what we can do about it. This book absolutely blew my mind, not only because of all the fascinating science inside of it, but because of the huge personal and societal ramifications of that science. Anna Lembke is an American psychiatrist who is chief of the Addiction Medicine Dual Diagnosis Clinic at Stanford University. In this book, she takes the science she's learned from a career working with addiction and applies it to all of us living in a society of compulsive overconsumption. The central premise of the book is this: pleasure and pain are processed in the same center of the brain, and it works like a teeter-totter, moving from one side and back to the other. In the studying of this system, researchers have come up with one overarching and surprising truth. This balance system wants to be level. We might feel as though we want to tip the scale towards pleasure all of the time, but this is fundamentally impossible. Our brain has strong and deep-seated mechanisms that attempt to always return the balance to its center position. No matter how hard we try to push our brain toward the side of pleasure, it pushes back against us, piling what the author terms pain gremlins onto the other side. If we press on one side of the balance, flooding our brain with pleasure chemicals from sugar or alcohol or entertainment, our brain pushes back. And when our source of pleasure ends, either we turn off the TV or our liver finally filters the last of the alcohol from our bloodstream, it takes time for all these pain gremlins to jump off the other side. And so in the meantime, this balance swings deeply the other way before returning to level. Drawn out over time, it looks like this. If we continue to push on the pleasure side over and over and over again, every time it starts to dip, making a pattern that looks like this, eventually our brain gets tired of playing the game. It runs out of pain gremlins to put on the other side, so what it does over time is slowly move the fulcrum toward the left, permanently tilting our brain's balance toward the side of pain. Once this happens, it takes a long time for the fulcrum to move back again. It's very important to mention at this point that this also works the other way. If we push on the pain side, say going for a long run in the freezing cold, then our brain will pile pleasure chemicals onto the other side of the balance in order to make it level. Then when we get done with the run, go home, sit down, we get this warm, glowing feeling of satisfaction and accomplishment that comes from all of those chemicals not having left the other side of the balance. But what does all of this mean in a larger context? The author tried to stick very closely to the science and to her field of expertise in addiction. But there was one moment at the end of chapter 1 where she alludes to the larger implications of her work.
Our compulsive overconsumption risks not just our demise, but also that of our planet. The world's natural resources are rapidly diminishing. Economists estimate that in 2040, the world's natural capital, land, forests, fisheries, fuels, will be 21% less in high-income countries and 17% less in poor countries than today. Meanwhile, carbon emissions will grow by 7% in high-income countries and 44% in the rest of the world. We are devouring ourselves.
We are consuming more and more in an attempt to feel more and more pleasure, but in the end, our brain balances it out and we get nowhere. Actually, it's worse than nowhere. We get to a place where we have to run and run as fast as we can just to stay in one place, constantly consuming just to maintain the imbalance that we've created in our brain. It seems as though the author is saying that fundamentally, there's nowhere to go. Neurologically, we can't make ourselves feel more pleasure in the long term. Our brain will always counteract it, fighting to bring ourselves back to level and eventually beyond. But something about this struck me as counterintuitive. I know there's people in my life that are happier and feel more pleasure than others. When I started thinking about this on a world scale, the first person that popped into my head was the Dalai Lama. He just exudes this happiness. You always see monks and people of Eastern practice that just exude this beautiful warmth and happiness, and I think what the author may be saying is that neurological science is finally proving what Buddhists have known for over 2,000 years, that a life lived in balance is a life lived in joy and happiness. Not pushing the balance back and forth in a constant attempt to eke out a little more pleasure, but maintaining the center and having times of purposeful renunciation of pleasure, so that if we change the balance at all, it will be to move the fulcrum slightly to the right, creating a brain that is permanently tipped toward the side of pleasure. One little aside I thought it would be worth mentioning that wasn't in the book was that if you look at the list of pleasure-first activities and pain-first activities, which we see here produce a net neutral outcome in the short term, pleasure-first activities are almost always detrimental to our health in the long term, whereas pain-first activities are almost always healthy. Thank you guys so much for listening. If you'd like to subscribe to my channel, I'm going to be doing more of these videos every week. Until then, have a great week.